This is a video presentation of Bible 2114, Unit 21, entitled Sources of Our Knowledge of Jesus. Your lecturer is Jerry Horner. The behavioral objectives for this unit are 1. To list factors which prepared for the coming of Christ into the world. 2. To list the major characteristics of each of the four Gospels. 3. To define the synoptic problem. 4. To discuss proposed solutions to the synoptic problem. 5. To identify the earliest secular references to Jesus. Paul said in Galatians 4:4 that Jesus was sent into the world when the fullness of time was come. In other words, it was when world conditions were exactly right for his coming that Jesus came. There never has been in history any other generation better suited for the coming of Christ than the generation in which he did come. At the time of Augustus, the Roman world embraced all the territory from the Euphrates River to the Atlantic Ocean, and from the Danube River and the southern borders of Scotland to the Sahara Desert. This meant that the entire Mediterranean world was under one roof. Under Augustus, one of the world's most efficient organizations was perfected, with the resulting era of peace, security, and progress that has seldom been equaled. Unconsciously, Rome was preparing the way for the gospel of Christ. It would be difficult to overestimate this contribution. In many ways, it was easier for Paul to travel around the Mediterranean world than it would be for a missionary today. He could pass from one territory to another without being stopped at the boundaries by customs officials. The triumph of Roman armies had established the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Everywhere, people lived in peace. Life and property were secure. Commerce flourished and peaceful pursuits were enjoyed. The Mediterranean Sea, so long plagued and plundered by pirates, was cleared of this menace by government ships. Over this body of water, except in the cold of winter, ships sailed back and forth and served to keep the various peoples of the empire in constant touch with one another. The thousands of miles of famous Roman roads and bridges that spanned the empire made travel easy and served to unite the various nations under Roman authority. One great route ran from Ephesus in Asia Minor to the Euphrates. The famous Egnatian Road stretched from the Adriatic Sea far to the east. Many smaller roads in other parts of the empire made travel, trade, and communication relatively easy. How solidly these roads were constructed is demonstrated by the fact that portions of them are still in use even today. Over these roadways and sea lanes, Paul and other apostles traveled to various parts of the Mediterranean world, carrying the gospel to the Gentiles. Justice was administered under the imperial government to a remarkable degree. The Romans had a genius for law. This offered a protection for the messengers of Christ, as is evidenced by Paul's experiences at Corinth and at Ephesus. A universal language was in use in every part of the empire. Thanks to the results of Alexander's conquest, the Greek language had become the common medium of communication throughout the territories which composed the Roman Empire. In Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Babylonia, Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, and Italy, the same language could be heard in the marts of trade and ports of commerce. All this was of the utmost significance for the early spread of Christianity. The preachers of the new faith could proclaim the glad tidings of salvation everywhere throughout the empire in the common Greek tongue. Language barriers as well as political boundaries had been swept away by Greece and Rome in preparation for the spread of the first great world religion. It is no accident that the New Testament was written in Greek, because Koine Greek, or the language of the common man in the first century, is generally conceded to be the most effective vehicle ever for expressing thought. Not only did the early Christian missionaries have Roman roads on which to travel, Roman peace to protect them as they traveled, and the Greek language in which to preach the gospel, but they also carried with them the sacred Hebrew scriptures in the new universal language. About 200 years before Christ, the Old Testament had been translated into Greek. This translation was known as the Septuagint. So the Christian missionaries in the first century were spared not only the arduous task of learning a new language, but also the still more difficult task of translating the scriptures into that language. The conquest of Alexander spread Greek culture and learning, as well as the Greek language, throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. It was thus made easier to explain the truth of Christianity in the common thought concepts that the Greeks had furnished. In one sense, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had helped to prepare the way for Christ. They had not only led the people to see the folly of their belief in the many gods of Greece, but they had also pointed the way to a higher concept of the supreme being and of the universe. Paul and John used the vocabulary of Greek philosophy and of the mystery religions to portray the wonderful truths concerning Christ and his relation to the universe. However, Greek philosophy, like all other merely human thinking, had failed to find ultimate truth. Morally and spiritually, the Greco-Roman world of the first century was bankrupt. The pagan religions of the empire were impotent, if not already dead. To be sure, the forms continued to exist, but the power was gone. The rise of individualism had made men conscious of their strivings and hopes, sufferings and desires. The mystery religions of Greece and the Orient had nourished the longing for redemption and personal immortality, but because of their inability to purify man's ethical and spiritual nature, they were unable to satisfy the desires they fed. There is abundant evidence of the deep hunger of heart which people of that century and the empire had for spiritual truth. In reality, the world was crying for God. That cry is well expressed in the words of Seneca, "Where shall he be found, whom we have been seeking for so many centuries?" There was an air of expectancy as people in their moral, economic, and religious destitution dared hope for something better. The presence of Jewish synagogues everywhere in the Roman Empire facilitated very greatly the early spread of Christianity. Whenever Paul entered a new city, his customary procedure was to join the worshipers in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. When given an opportunity to speak, he would preach Christ from the Old Testament. This gave him a starting point for his evangelization of the city. Another thing that helped was the fact that through the synagogue services, many pious Gentiles had been drawn to appreciate the monotheism, morality, and messianic hope of Judaism. These God-fearers furnished a fertile and cultivated field in which the early missionaries sowed the gospel seed. The Jews, by establishing synagogues throughout the Gentile world and teaching the heathen about the one true God, had done much to prepare the way for the coming of Christ. In fact, the dispersion of Jews among the nations was the largest single factor in the preparation for Christianity. Everything was ready. Both heart and head were prepared for the advent of Christ and the universal gospel. Because the gospel was designed to meet the deepest need of each individual, it had a universal appeal. Thus it was that when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son. The four Gospels are the primary sources for most of our knowledge of the events of Jesus' saving life and death. They are therefore records of supreme worth to the entire race of sinful men. Since they are so valuable, it is important that we have a knowledge of their origin and validity. It comes as a surprise to many people that Jesus had no stenographer present to take down his teachings as he uttered them. In fact, it was several years before the Gospels were written. Many factors delayed the production of the Gospels. As long as Jesus was with them, there was no need to write, and the apostles found it difficult to believe that he would not be with them always. After his death, they expected him to return soon, and so there was no incentive for writing a record of his life. As long as Christianity was confining its efforts within the boundaries of Palestine, little need was felt for a written gospel. Furthermore, there was a Palestinian aversion to the writing of other books in addition to the Old Testament, which was regarded as sufficient. Collections of Old Testament proof texts were considered adequate for a record of Christ's life. In addition, the vivid account of the eyewitnesses was preferred to the more impersonal written record. Emphasis was placed on the inner life of the Spirit instead of the written letter of the Word. In addition to this, the high cost of writing materials made the possession of written documents difficult or impossible for poor Galilean peasants. Finally, the art of writing was not common, and the apostles were not literary men by preparation or calling. They had been commissioned to preach and evangelize, not to write. Even though the four Gospels deal with a common subject, the good news concerning Jesus Christ, the views of Christ they present differ in certain respects. It has often been asked why there should have been four Gospels composed instead of only one. The answer seems fairly obvious. No one writer can be expected to appreciate all the phases of the life and character of his hero. One point of view is never complete or satisfactory. The Gospels were written by different men at different times and in different places for different audiences, and they were written from different perspectives. Both the authors and the early readers of the Gospels regarded each Gospel as a separate narrative complete for its purpose, and apparently the Gospels were circulated independently among Christian communities. Toward the end of the 2nd century, Tatian weaved the materials of the four Gospels into one continuous narrative which he called the Diatessaron. However, his work proved unacceptable because of the individuality of each Gospel. No one of the Gospels, nor all four together, constitute a biography of Jesus. Indeed, the Gospels themselves make no claim to give complete accounts of everything that Jesus did or said. For instance, John 20:30 declares, "And many other signs therefore did Jesus in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book." Each Gospel writer selected those things in the ministry of Jesus that best carried out his purpose. Therefore, each Gospel was designed and adapted to produce its own impression of Christ, independent of the others, and each is complete in the sense that it carries out the intent of its author. Anyone who examines carefully a harmony of the Gospels, in which similar or identical material is printed in parallel columns, must see at once that Matthew, Mark, and Luke present a common outline of the life of Christ. In addition to this, he will see many statements in two or more of the Gospels that are almost alike, and some that are identical. Because they strongly resemble each other in arrangement, content, and phraseology, the first three Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels, from a Greek word which means a seeing together. The mutual relations of the three accounts has given rise to the synoptic problem. If the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are independent of each other, why are they so similar to each other, even having exact verbal agreement in many places? On the other hand, if they have a literary relationship to each other, why are there frequent divergences in the accounts of Jesus' ministry? Briefly stated, then, the synoptic problem is the problem of how to account for the similarities and the differences among the first three Gospels. Did the writers copy from each other, or did they have a common source, or did they collaborate? Many theories have been proposed to explain the relationship between the synoptic Gospels, but the most popular one to date is called the documentary hypothesis. This theory asserts that Matthew and Luke base their Gospels on Mark and on an unknown document designated by the letter Q, which stands for the German word for source. Proponents of this view diligently point out that Mark is entirely reproduced in Matthew, and that the latter two agree against Mark. The material common to Matthew and Luke, but which is not found in Mark, comes from Q. An amplification of this so-called two-document theory is the four-document theory. This view includes an M document, the source of the material found only in Matthew, and an L document, the source of the material peculiar to Luke. The documentary theory has many weaknesses. For one, it rests entirely upon the priority of Mark. Even though there is almost universal agreement that Mark was the first gospel to be written, that fact has never been ascertained. The best supporting evidence for Mark's priority seems to be the supposition that all things move from the simple to the complex, but this is not always the case. Actually, early tradition is almost unanimous in claiming that Matthew was written first, and on the basis of strong evidence, it appears that Mark was the third gospel to be written, after Matthew and Luke. Furthermore, no trace of the hypothetical document Q has ever been found, and the same is true of M and L. Matthew would need no such sources anyway, since, as an apostle, he had first-hand information concerning most of the events and sayings he recorded. Luke indicates that before he began to write, he investigated in an accurate manner from the beginning the things pertaining to the life of Christ. It seems unlikely that he would include Mark's gospel in the inaccurate earlier narratives. On the whole, this theory, as well as others, lacks enough supporting evidence to warrant its acceptance. The fact that each writer had a distinctive purpose in mind as he wrote would influence both the content of his gospel and the arrangement of the material. Each gospel was written with a certain group in mind. Matthew was directed to Jews, Mark to Romans, and Luke to Gentiles also, probably Greeks. This no doubt influenced both the choice and the arrangement of materials. The facts concerning the life and ministry of Jesus were handed down orally before there was a written gospel. For example, in Acts 20:35, Paul quotes a saying of Jesus not recorded in any of the Gospels. As already stated, the oral teaching would account for many of the similarities in the synoptics. There were written accounts of the life of Christ before our Gospels were set down. This is evident from Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. It is altogether possible and even probable that the writers of the synoptic Gospels knew each other by personal contact. Perhaps there was an interchange of information among them which would explain much of their common material, while their own personal research and interest would account for their differences. The inspiration of the Holy Spirit was behind the writing of each of the Gospels. In John 14:26, Jesus assured his disciples, "The Holy Spirit will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you." Although the book of Matthew itself is anonymous, tradition is unanimous in ascribing it to Matthew, a tax collector whom Jesus called to be one of his disciples. Very little was known about him, other than his name and occupation. After the first chapter of Acts, he disappears from the history of the church. Tradition says that for 15 years Matthew preached in Palestine and then went on missionary journeys to foreign nations. Papias, who lived around A.D. 100, stated that Matthew wrote his gospel in the Hebrew tongue and that the readers interpreted it as best as they could, that is, translated it into Greek. Other early accounts make the same claim. It is likely that Matthew later produced a Greek edition of his gospel. It has already been stated that each writer of the Gospels was confronted with a definite need and formed a definite purpose for his gospel and selected his materials under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. The number of Christians rapidly multiplied in the months following the ascension of Jesus. Then came persecution and dispersion, intensified by the death of Stephen. A written account of the life of Christ was needed and confirm these persecuted believers in their faith, connecting the message of the Old Testament Gospels and proving that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah. Matthew is just such an account. From the testimonies of such early writers as Papias, it appears that Matthew wrote his Aramaic Gospel around A.D. 45. Shortly thereafter, about A.D. 50, he must have published his Greek edition. Matthew is the Jewish Gospel, written to prove to the Jews that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. This Gospel serves as the connecting link between the Old and the New Testament, and contains more than 60 references to the Old Testament. Matthew depicts the Messiah as the King, and the word of Christ is emphasized throughout the Gospel. The kingdom of heaven also receives emphasis in Matthew. Of all the Gospel writers, he alone uses the term, and that 33 times. Matthew is the teaching Gospel. At least 6 major discourses of Jesus are found in the book, comprising about 3/5 of the entire Gospel. Matthew is the only Gospel in which the word church occurs, in chapter 16, verse 18, and chapter 18, verse 17. Although it is strongly Jewish in its character, the Gospel does show an interest in Gentiles. The evidence that Mark wrote the gospel that bears his name is early and unanimous. There is also strong evidence based on the testimony of such early writers as Papias, Justin Martyr, and Irenaeus that Peter was the apostolic source behind Mark. Mark was the son of the Mary who lived in Jerusalem and whose home was one of the meeting places of the early church. His full name was John Mark, John being his Jewish name, and Mark his Roman name. Mark accompanied Barnabas and Paul on the first missionary journey, but abandoned the enterprise before it was completed. He later proved himself to be a loyal servant of the Lord, and was heartily commended by Paul in 2 Timothy 4:11. Still later, in 1 Peter 5:13, he was associated with Peter. The question of the date of Mark has already been discussed somewhat, at least as it relates to Matthew and Luke. The earliest witnesses to the gospel almost unanimously connected with the preaching of Peter in Rome, either late in Peter's life or shortly after his death. If the tradition is accepted, Mark could not have written his gospel before A.D. 56, for when Paul wrote to the Romans that year, no apostle had yet visited Rome. It is also certain that the book was written before the destruction of Jerusalem in A.D. 70. The bulk of the evidence seems to support a date between 65 and 70 for the writing of Mark. Mark presents Jesus as the servant of the Lord. His subject is summed up in the words of the opening verse, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The importance of the works of Jesus dominates the narrative, receiving more stress than the formal teachings of Jesus. The key verse is 10:45. Mark is characterized by its brevity. It is the shortest of the Gospels, containing no genealogy and no account of the birth and early Judean ministry of Jesus. Mark is the gospel of action. No other gospel moves so rapidly from one scene to another. John's gospel is a studied portrait of the Lord. Matthew and Luke present a series of colored slides, but Mark's gospel is a motion picture film of the life of Jesus. The activity in Mark is accented by the use of the Greek word, which is usually translated in English as straightway, immediately, or forthwith. The word occurs 42 times in Mark, more than all the rest of the New Testament. Mark's frequent use of the Greek imperfect tense also moves the narrative at a rapid pace. Mark is the gospel of vividness. Vivid, striking phrases occur frequently to allow the reader to form a mental picture of the scene described. The looks and gestures of Jesus receive unusual attention. There are many Latinisms in the Gospel of Mark. On the other hand, there is little emphasis on Jewish law and custom, and when they are mentioned, they are interpreted for the reader. This seems to be in accord with the tradition that Mark wrote for a Roman audience. Early tradition declares that Luke, the Gentile physician and companion of Paul, wrote the third gospel. On the basis of internal evidence, the Lucan authorship cannot be disputed. The writer of this gospel was also the writer of the book of Acts, and therefore any data derived from Acts pertaining to authorship could also be applied to the gospel. As we shall see later, Luke was undoubtedly the author of Acts. Luke is mentioned by name only 3 times in the New Testament, in Colossians 4:14, Philemon 24, and 2 Timothy 4:11. These passages reveal that Luke was a physician who was a loyal friend to Paul, and that he was highly esteemed by Paul as a companion in labor. Luke himself states that the immediate purpose of his book was that Theophilus, a person of rank and nobility, might know the certainty of those things in which he was instructed. However, Luke did not intend the gospel merely for Theophilus, but undoubtedly wrote it for Gentile converts in general, particularly Greeks. His gospel has a universal outlook, and he presents the good news of Christ as being meant for the entire world. Luke also shows his readers that their faith is based on firm historic facts. Luke's gospel was written prior to Acts, and since Acts was written during Paul's first Roman imprisonment, the gospel must have been written at least before AD 63. Since Luke was in Caesarea while Paul was in prison there, he would have had ample opportunity during that time to conduct the investigation which he mentions in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Very likely he wrote the gospel during this period, which would be around AD 58 to 60. Luke's gospel is marked by historical accuracy. No other writer so carefully gives dates for his narrative as does Luke in such places as 1:5, 2:1, and 3:1 and 2. The gospel has great literary beauty. The vocabulary and polished style indicates that the writer was a man of high culture. The gospel shows an interest in medical and scientific matters. Luke is the universal gospel, showing that salvation is for all. Luke gives prominence to certain groups such as women, children, and the rich and the poor. Luke emphasizes prayer, especially the prayer life of Jesus. The Gospel records 7 occasions on which Jesus prayed, which are not found elsewhere. The Gospel places an emphasis on praise and thanksgiving. Luke stresses the humanity of Jesus. The gospel pictures Jesus as having the development, emotions, and powers of a man. The external evidence weighs heavily toward the Apostle John as the author of the fourth gospel. The early church fathers all held that John wrote the book. The internal evidence is just as strong. The author was a Jew who had an intimate familiarity with the Old Testament and with Jewish tradition. Not only was he a Jew, but he was a Palestinian Jew who had personal acquaintance with Palestine, and particularly with Jerusalem and its environment. It is quite evident also that the author was an eyewitness of the events which he narrated. According to John 21, verses 20, 23, and 24, the writer is identified with a beloved disciple who was a companion of Peter and who had been near Jesus at the Last Supper, 13:23, at the trial, 18, 15, and 16, and at the cross, chapter 19, verses 26 and 27. The only conclusion that can be reached on the basis of both the external and internal evidence is that John the Apostle wrote the gospel which bears his name. The statements of many of the early Christian writers indicate that John wrote his gospel at Ephesus in response to the entreaties of believers in that area. There is no reason to dispute that testimony. Apparently, since John spent his later years at Ephesus, he wrote the gospel toward the close of the first century, around AD 85 to 90. John has a clearer statement concerning his purpose in writing than do the other gospels. He says in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, "Many other signs, therefore, did Jesus in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." The Gospel of John is marked by a great theological depth. Even though it is the most theological of the Gospels, however, it is distinguished by its simplicity. The Gospel is noted for its repetition of fundamental terms and ideas, such as life, light, darkness, truth. John emphasizes the person of Christ, presenting him as God-man. Both the deity and the humanity of Jesus are stressed. While the synoptic Gospels, for the most part, omit the early Judean ministry of Jesus, John emphasizes it. It is possible that John was consciously attempting to supplement the account of the ministry of Jesus as found in the synoptics. In fact, 90% of the material in John is unique. The miracles of Jesus in John's Gospel are designated signs. 6 of the 8 miracles recorded are peculiar to John, chosen as evidence that Jesus is the Son of God. There is little information about the history of Jesus from outside the New Testament. Only 3 Latin writers refer to Christ by name. Pliny, governor of Bithynia, writing to the Emperor Trajan in the year 112 about the superstition of Christianity, reports that it was the custom of the Christians on a fixed day to assemble before daylight and sing by turns a hymn to Christ as a god. Tacitus, in his Annals, written in the year 115, tells how a great fire in Rome was blamed on Christians. He states, "Christ, from whom they derived their name, was put to death in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate." Suetonius, a contemporary of Tacitus, tells how the Emperor Claudius banished the Jews from Rome when they made a constant rioting at the instigation of Christus. Josephus, a Jewish writer who lived in the last half of the first century, wrote an extensive history of the Jews entitled The Antiquities of the Jews. It was published in 93. 3 passages in this book relating to the life of Christ may be noted. The first passage gives an account of Herod's action in killing John the Baptist, which is of value in support of the validity of the gospel records. Another passage records specific statements about Jesus, although many scholars have disputed the validity of the passage. Nevertheless, it may be genuine and thus deserves our consideration. Here is the passage which Josephus wrote. About this time arose Jesus, a wise man, if indeed it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful deeds, and a teacher of men who gladly received the truth. He drew to himself many, both of the Jews and of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, on the indictment of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him at the first did not cease to do so, for he appeared to them again alive on the third day, the divine prophets having foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things about him. And even to this day, the race of Christians who are named from him has not died out. The third passage in the Antiquities records the stoning of, quote, James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, end of quote. There are several allusions to Jesus in the Jewish Talmud, but they are late, slanderous, and worthless. They describe Jesus as a sorcerer, one who ridiculed the wise men, who led the people astray, and who was hanged on the eve of the Passover. His disciples, 5 in number, are said to have cured sick people in their master's name. What these references do prove is that there is no reason to doubt the existence of Jesus. Men, as a rule, do not vehemently slander myths. In review of the lecture, we have noted that it was no accident that Jesus came into the world at the time that he did. God is in control of history, and for centuries he had been preparing this world stage for the greatest dramatic event in history. Politically, economically, morally, and religiously, all the conditions were ready for the coming of Jesus into the world. The main source of our information about Jesus is the 4 Gospels. They are rightly so called, for strictly speaking, the first 4 books of the New Testament are not biographies of Jesus, they are personal testimonies. They bear witness to Christ and to the good news of his salvation. Therefore, each author selected, arranged, and presented his material according to his own purpose. It is much like 4 newspaper reporters going out to cover the same event. Although they all witnessed the same thing, their stories, while not contradictory, are written from different perspectives. Hence, Matthew, writing to the Jews, presents Jesus as the kingly Messiah. Mark, the Gospel of Action, introduces to a Roman audience Jesus as the mighty servant of God, before whom nothing could stand. Luke's Gospel is the longest one of the 4. It is also the most literary, as befitting a cultured, educated Greek. He presents to a Gentile audience Jesus Christ as a universal Savior, as the Son of Man, the perfect man. John, in deep contemplation, dwells on the person of Christ, describing him as the God-man. Early secular references to Jesus bear witness to the historicity of the gospel record. This has been a video presentation of Bible 2114. This is the end of the tape.